It's Thursday, August 14th, 2025, and we're shooting this video one day before the big summit meeting between Russian President Vladimir Putin and US President Donald Trump. That's to take place in Alaska tomorrow, August 15th. Now, last week, Steve Witkoff's Trump's special envoy visited Moscow with this proposal that the two presidents meet together. And over the past week, they've hammered out the details, and there's going to be a meeting tomorrow in Alaska. Initially, Trump had given Putin 50 days to halt hostilities. And if he didn't do it, Trump was going to impose the sanction regime authored by Senators Graham and Blumenthal. And then he lowered his deadline to 10 days. And that expiration date was last Friday. And because of the summit plans, the sanctions weren't put into place. And frankly, I don't think that Trump wants the sanction regime put into place right now, because he understands the wider impact that they're going to, he understands the impact they're going to have on the wider economy and not just Russia and third parties that Russia is using for trade. And so I think that that's part of what has motivated Trump to slow down on imposing the new sanctions regime on Russia. I still think he's going to do it. I still think he wants to do it. Much of what I'm seeing right now, as I've said in many other videos, seems to me to be theater, where you can come out of a meeting with Putin and say, well, we gave it a shot. He's being intransigent. He wasted my time. We put all this together. So now we're going to impose the sanctions, potentially even worse than Trump initially wanted to, because the bill, the sanctions regime authored by Blumenthal and Lindsey Graham, they're wanting 500% sanctions on the Russians. And Trump, when he started with this 50-day deadline nonsense, he just wanted 100% tariffs. And I think that the countries that continue to trade with Russia, he would deal with on an individual basis, as he did with India last week, because he imposed 50% tariffs on India for continuing to trade, to buy Russian oil. And so some of this stuff is starting to slowly unfold. Hard to tell what direction this is going to take when this meeting happens. I would argue that the war isn't going to be the only thing that's discussed. I think there's probably going to be small breakthroughs on maybe the economic portion of these talks. But outside of that, I don't think we're going to see anything of a breakthrough tomorrow. I think that when those meetings are finished, they're going to probably be very vague about what they discussed and the conclusions that they reached, and that they're going to probably set up another summit meeting somewhere else within the next month or whatever. But ultimately, I'm saying that I don't think that there's going to be any kind of breakthroughs or anything like that. So this is kind of a summary of what's going on. This is from the Wall Street Journal. And these are the alleged proposals that the Russians have made. And these, again, this comes from the Wall Street Journal. The Financial Times had a similar article. And I'm going to say that I am very skeptical about some of these proposals. I think we'll definitely know. I think we already know what the Russians' expectations are and red lines are for any negotiations or ceasefires to take place. But this is resourced. This is the Wall Street Journal, and this is their resources that they've obtained this from. And I believe many of these are anonymous officials from the administration, so I just take a lot of this with a grain of salt. But this is just kind of an overview of what we're looking at right now. So Ukraine would have to hand over its eastern regions known as Donbass. And this is very important because we're just talking about Lugansk and Donetsk. We're not talking about the other two oblasts that Russia has annexed and made a part of Russia, Zaporozhye and Kherson. Trump said on Wednesday the Russian leader's offer wasn't a breakthrough, but was enticing enough to begin organizing a summit meeting, which is weird because, again, this is really nothing. This is kind of principles. We've talked about principles before a negotiations takes place. And this seems pretty broad in general. And so I think that when the specifics start to come out, That's when you're going to obviously see the problems, as we've seen over the course of the past 7 months with Trump's handling of this Russia situation. It's like when the nitty gritty comes out, him and Marco Rubio and his team they act like we don't even know what they're talking about. All we know is that, the Ukrainians need protections, they need security guarantees, and Putin just keeps killing people. That's what they do. Every time you see the specifics, when Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister in Russia, or when Putin himself, when they say specifically what they want and what would be required for a ceasefire, it's like the Trump administration just says, I don't even know what they said. They just ignore it, right? And they keep saying, we don't know what they want. We don't know what it's going to take for a ceasefire. They're just being intransigent. It's like, no, they're saying it right out loud, but you don't want to hear it. So, article goes on, Putin told Witkoff he would agree to a complete ceasefire if Ukraine agreed to withdraw forces from all of Ukraine's eastern Donetsk region. Again, very specifically, the 2 oblasts. And that's Donetsk. So that's just one of the oblasts. Pardon me. Russia would then control the Donetsk and Lugansk regions, as well as the Crimean Peninsula, which it seized in 2014. And Russia wants recognition of the territory, international recognition of the territory that they've annexed, Crimea, Donetsk, and Lugansk. And it's hard for me, again, to even take what I just read seriously. And that's largely because Crimea is a very central part of this. And if they were to cede Kherson and Zaporozhye, this would be problematic because of the accessibility between the mainland and Crimea, this issue. So if Ukraine still controlled those oblasts, they could still potentially harass Crimea and the Crimean Bridge in these areas. And so, the article continues, Russia now occupies most of Donetsk and Lugansk, but Ukrainian forces still control sizable chunks of territory, including key cities that are now strongholds of its defense. And if you look at a map, you'll see that where the Russians are in these 2 oblasts, there's like a chain of industrial cities, big cities that make natural barriers to the rest, to the flatlands on the western part of Ukraine. And so they're very strategic. They've been built up over time. And this is kind of the last string. This is where the Russians are right now. You're talking about Pokrovsk, Slovyansk, Kramatorsk, I believe Seversk, and Konstantinivka. Pardon me for butchering some of these names. Let's see. So we're getting into phases, first phase agreements. And this is why I'm kind of skeptical of this. Every time we talk about phased agreements between the U.S. and any country, we see that they kind of fall apart. So I'm talking particularly about phased agreements that the U.S. has brokered between Israel and Hamas. They fall apart usually at the first stage, but we've talked about that in other videos. So in the first phase, Ukraine would withdraw from Donetsk and the battle lines would be frozen. That would be followed by a second phase in which Putin and Trump would agree on a final peace plan that would later be negotiated with President Zelensky. Zelensky had previously said that he would only discuss territorial issues after Russia agreed to a full unconditional ceasefire, a point Ukrainian officials have repeatedly emphasized. And if you remember, this is kind of what facilitated the halt in talks, high-level talks between the U.S., brokered by the U.S. a few months ago, because once more, the Russians have said, here are the conditions for a ceasefire, because if we just stop firing, you guys are going to, build up and reorganize and all these other things, and you're going to start the war again. And so it has to be conditional on the Russian side. The Ukrainians don't want any conditions at all. And Zelensky is still after security guarantees. And I think this is very important to understand. After all this time and after all these discussions, he's still demanding security guarantees, and he's calling any talks or discussions made during the summit dead on arrival. He's not going to honor them. Now, Trump's deadline for Russia to agree to a ceasefire expired Friday. We're talking about, again, the sanctions package. And as we mentioned earlier, he imposed 50% tariffs on India, which is, of course, a major importer of Russian oil. Now, I just want to say some general things about, these proposal ideas. I think that they are basically not going to be what we're going to see in this meeting tomorrow, right? I think there's been a lot of misinformation going on, and in the Western media, a narrative is trying to be shaped before this summit meeting takes place, obviously. And so a lot of what we're reading is, it kind of, gives a decent foundation of what's going on and a basic understanding of the importance of the upcoming negotiations. But a lot of it is noise. A lot of it is noise coming from the administration, from Europeans, from the Ukrainians. A lot of it is noise coming from all these entities to create some confusion and to shape the narrative, right, for the consumer, if you will. Now, given the volume of claims being made about the proposals by administrative sources, both publicly and anonymously, we can only guess on exactly what each side is presently offering. And I don't even think that we have to guess. These are just notes of mine. This is from the journal. But I don't think we have to guess on what each side is offering. I think that we have a pretty good idea from the Russian side of what's being proposed, what's potentially being proposed. And I don't think it's going to fall any short of what has initially been Russian red lines when it comes to enacting some kind of ceasefire. Now, some have offered that maybe Witkoff may have not completely understood the proposals about a ceasefire that Trump was making last week. And that's why we have some of this convoluted messaging. And in my estimation, I think that Trump is still uncommitted. He mentioned this being a meeting to feel Putin out a few days ago, which again, this says that they're just going to be talking of principles, and it's going to be a photo op moment. That's going to be the bigger part of it. I predict that, after this meeting, after the photos are taken and all these things, some nice things are going to probably be said. There might be some kind of joint presser, and then maybe a few days later, Trump is going to crash out on Truth Social again and probably impose the sanctions. Then that's my prediction, as I've said earlier. The sanctions are going into place. Let's just put it that way. He also, in my estimation, Trump also doesn't take an interest in the root causes of the conflict that Putin has repeatedly said would need to be resolved for a ceasefire to take place. He's still going into these negotiations without so much as he hasn't said anything since he's come into office about the very specific things that would need to take place before a negotiated settlement or a ceasefire happens. He's gone out of his way. I think that Marco Rubio in particular has gone out of his way to avoid many of these things. I mean, he just had a meeting after the summit was announced last week. Marco Rubio, I think it was on Fox News that he had this meeting where he was discussing the summit. And he said, for the first time, I think that we understand what the Russians want and what they're requiring for some kind of peace to take place. And of course, he was glazing Trump and all these things. And I just said, wow, that's funny, because I've known, and many people who follow this have known since last year, exactly what the Russians wanted for a ceasefire to take place, right? Known it earlier this year. Your administration knows it. You guys just don't talk about it. You stay vague and you don't say anything about it. You don't acknowledge any of those things. And so, similar to what Trump was doing with Iran, which is basically pretending to negotiate and saying, essentially, look, we'll have discussions with you, Iran, but after the deadline, you're just going to have to agree with what we put in front of your face. Trump wants to do this with Russia too. I'm not too confident that it's going to work for him, and his ego is going to be hurt. Now, Russian sources don't seem to have confirmed a departure from their original positions, stated last year and this year, as we just talked about. Those positions being demilitarization, withdrawal from all 4 oblasts of the Ukrainian army, international recognition of oblasts as Russian. So as it relates to these potential land swaps, these swaps have been mentioned, and again, these are Western media claims. The most likely scenario would be if swaps were to take place in the northern part of the battle line, in Sumy and Kharkiv, where activity, there's land under Ukrainian land under Russian control, but it's not that much, right? And so I could see them swapping that land with the Ukrainians in some formulation. But I think the bigger issue is that the northern battle line is basically there as in Putin's words, he wanted to create a buffer zone in the northern part. And so perhaps this is the negotiating land swap that they would be putting on the table. So I don't believe Trump and Witkoff made this proposal because they were wanting to avoid problem. As I said earlier, that I think they're wanting to avoid the problems that sanctions will cause on the U.S. economy. And the other thing is, I would say, Trump hasn't given any inclination that he has an issue continuing the sanctions regime against Russia. And I'm not really fooled by the uncertainty that Trump tries to insert into this situation, this special military operation, this war between Russia and Ukraine. Trump is, as I've said before, he goes in several different directions with this. One day he's upset with Putin, next day he's upset with Ukraine. I'm not really fooled by it because we've seen his actions since his first term as it relates to Russia. Signing legislation authored by Ted Cruz to try to kill Nord Stream, providing Ukraine with lethal aid. We've already went through all of it. And Trump basically continued on a higher scale the hostile posture towards Russia that had always been there since, the fall of the Soviet Union. He continued it. He said a lot of things. He said, I like Putin and I want to talk to him and all this stuff. But he continued the same thing, right? He always says this is Biden's war. Like, no, it's not. It's your war along with several other presidents. So stop. You need to own it. He never will, of course. So he doesn't have a problem continuing the sanctions regime. And like I said, I think that's going to continue. And it may not be at the level of the Graham Blumenthal package, but it's going to happen. And for me, I would say this isn't about Ukraine for Trump. And I think it's about Putin, really, right? I think if Putin remains intransigent and doesn't kiss Trump's ass, I don't think Trump is going to try to do the Iranian treatment on Russia, but I do think that he'll continue, again, to isolate Russia by any means, regardless of how it benefits Ukraine, because it's egos that we're worried about here. Trump is worried about his ego and his standing. He knows that half of the country still believes he's some kind of Russian asset. That really hurt him in his first term. It made him feel insecure, even though it, couldn't really place the blame on Putin. It hurt him because, as I've said in other videos, his legitimacy was brought into question in his first term because of, the Russia collusion thing. And so forever he's got a chip on his shoulder. And he also knows that someone like Putin just doesn't buy his bullshit. Okay. And so for him, I don't think that he cares too much about Ukraine. I think that he's just going to continue again to do what all the other presidents have done and try to contain Russia, try to hurt them. I think he's going to continue this policy. But one of the reasons why I think he's going to continue in this posture is because it's just his ego. Putin makes him feel very insecure. And you can see this by the way he talks. I think Russians in general make many in his administration, including him, feel insecure. And so this is why he takes this posture, why he can't just extricate himself from the situation and leave it alone. There are a lot of other factors, I think. But this is something that I think is important to recognize. It's not about Ukraine. He has he doesn't care about that. But this is kind of like a situation where he's actually being challenged. right? He can kind of have his way with the Middle East, as Dmitry Medvedev said a couple days ago. They had a Twitter spat or something like that. And Medvedev basically says, well, you can talk like this if you want to as it relates to Israel and Iran, but you're talking about Russia now. So basically, don't fuck around. And I think that kind of thing, even if it's just a lot of posturing in theater by both sides, I think that's in the back of his mind. It bothers him, right? Especially now when, he's got a lot of Lilliputians, he's got a lot of yes men and yes women around him. And, in international affairs too, heads of state come over and they kiss his ass and do all these things. And the Russians aren't being submissive. They're also not being rude. And so I think this is kind of a combination that, that really bothers him because, he wants to bully them, but he's having some problems doing it, I guess. So it's interesting to see that dynamic between the two of them. And so we've got recent developments in the Caucasus that sort of reaffirm what I'm saying here about the inevitability of the sanctions regime and the continuation of this hostility from the U.S. To the Russians. Now, this is from Bloomberg. This is related to the recent peace that was brokered between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Now, the leaders of Armenia and Azerbaijan signed a Trump-brokered peace deal in the White House, ending decades of tension and conflict. The deal includes the creation of a highly profitable strategic corridor that passes through both countries. That corridor is known as the Zangezur Corridor, which will be developed by American companies and rebranded Trump Route for International Peace and Prosperity. Now, I don't have a map. I'm not the best when it comes to the technical things of podcasting, or else I could put a map up for you. But if anyone, I'm sure many of you may know already, but the Caucasus is like the underbelly countries of Russia, in conjunction with also the Central Asian countries. So Georgia, friendly to Russia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan are right below Georgia. And then you've got the, I forgot the ocean, but then you have the sea, and then you've got Turkey, right? I just want to make sure that I'm accurate here. Because the Adriatic is on the right side. Let's see here. Okay, yeah. So again, these are countries below Russia. They're underbelly. And you've got Georgia, and then you've got Azerbaijan, Armenia, and then Turkey is connected to Armenia. And then the Black Sea is up to the north. So Trump has brokered a peace between these two countries. They've historically had their problems, particularly with the enclave Nagorno-Karabakh. And Trump has, allegedly brokered a peace. We don't know how well this peace is going to hold together. We'll get further into it. But see, this is what he's doing below these countries bordering Russia, Russian territory, and Iranian territory. So we'll go on. Now, this corridor, the Zangezur corridor, it will include rail lines. The development of it will include rail lines, communication lines, oil and gas pipelines. Like many of the other endeavors that we've seen, whether it be, critical minerals deals that Trump has, made with Congo or with Ukraine or potentially in Pakistan. These are projects that I don't think will probably ever get off the ground. I think there are probably going to be a few people that are going to benefit from it, which we'll get into in a moment. But, it's a good political win. It's a good PR victory. It's a good thing for him to show up and see these two, historically warring countries get together and shake hands in front of him. It's a good PR. A lot of people will call it a victory, but let's go on and see what the bigger purpose of this is before we finish up. So the corridor would forge a pathway from the stands in Central Asia down through the Caucasus to Turkey and beyond to the world, effectively revitalizing the old Silk Road. which means it would bypass both Russia and Iran, right? This means an economic impact for Russia should this project come to fruition. Huge economic impact, because most of the trade right now that goes into Europe goes through Russia, through what they call the northern route. So for President Trump, the additional benefits includes new leverage for his upcoming Ukraine peace talks with Putin, added leverage against Iran, and what nobody has mentioned, the replacement of China's trade route, the Belt and Road Initiative, from linking via Iran at its final critical outlet stage. So this affects the Belt and Road Initiative that China has put into place, and it gives Trump leverage over negotiations with the Russians, and also in this ongoing situation that's going on with Iran, which isn't over yet. We're just not going to cover it in this episode. So how do you protect all those assets? This seems like some kind of economic development plan Trump is putting into place. How do we protect those assets? We'll get to that in just a moment. Another factor that goes unmentioned in the global coverage about TRIP is the fate of Tbilisi, and this is in Georgia. Currently, Georgia benefits substantially from acting as a trade route, not least for the oil pipeline that goes from Baku to Tbilisi to Ceyhan in Turkey. The Zangezur corridor would render all that superfluous, thereby delivering a blow to Georgia's economy. And you have to remember that this corridor, again, you've got Armenia, and there's this enclave that Azerbaijan inhabits, and you've got Azerbaijan on the other side. So you've got like this sliver of land that separates the enclave, the Azerbaijani enclave, and Azerbaijan itself. And that corridor in between there is what we're talking about. And so the outlook for TRIP and the peace deal is not all smooth sailing. Most recently, a top Iranian minister openly threatened repercussions against it, saying this corridor will not become a passage owned by Trump, but rather a graveyard for Trump's mercenaries. And again, this is sort of an economic development plan that he's going to be working on in conjunction with these countries. And with the prosperity that's reaped from it, these people are going to need protection, right? Turkey is a NATO country. Could it be that, eventually these countries are put on a pathway to NATO, and that what we're seeing in Ukraine right now could end up spiraling out of control in the Caucasus region? Again, it wouldn't be the first time the Russians had to fight in the Caucasus. So it's almost like Trump is saying, well, look, we're going to have these negotiations with the Russians, but, here's something that kind of shows, that illustrates the seriousness of Trump as it relates to these negotiations. Is he serious doing something like trying to insert himself directly in the Caucasus, in Russia's sphere of influence? Is he serious? No. Right? And I've said this from the beginning. He's not serious, especially, again, after the Iran example. Months of negotiations, and then he bombs them. He's not serious about negotiations with Moscow. The Zangezur is essentially the equivalent of a Panama or Suez Canal, both of which needed Western military support for decades during and after completion. Protecting such an endeavor would certainly require boots on the ground, which rather contradicts President Trump's America First pledges to avoid foreign military entanglements. It would require boots on the ground. That's the first thing. And the second thing is you're putting those boots on the ground in a region that borders Iran. So this will certainly benefit Israel. It's not going to be much of a benefit for us in terms of, the trade and economic benefits. It'll benefit Europe, right? Because for years, this whole thing with this corridor is not new. All right, these discussions have been taking place for years now. But these countries, Armenia and Azerbaijan, they've had pretty tense relations, to say the least, for decades. And so this would require a U.S. involvement if U.S. contractors are being used for these development projects, I don't know that the Europeans are going to. I think Europeans would probably be involved too, but I don't think that they would be solely involved. So let's tease some of this out. As noted, this developing situation in the Caucasus works to isolate Russia's underbelly and potentially unlock the geopolitical and economic advancement of these countries, and by default, Western patronage and influence in the Caucasus and Central Asia. And B, to create hostility on Iran's northern border because of the outsized influence of Turkey and Azerbaijan and the Central Asian countries. It's like a chain, right? You think of Turkey right here, Armenia, that stands apart, Azerbaijan, largely Turkish-speaking population, and then across the Caspian, you've got Kazakhstan, all the stands, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. You've got all these Turkish-speaking people. So the influence is just completely outsized. Now, it works to a benefit for Israel because, and I guess to the U.S., because this could be, a way of, continuing the encirclement of Iran. But I think this would also be sort of a problem for Israel as well, because that empowers Turkey. And I don't think that Israel and Turkey are the most friendly. After all, I think I remember last year a couple of times Erdogan, their president, like talking about the Holocaust, talking about Bibi being Netanyahu being Hitler and all these things. So by no means they've had nothing good to say. I think that there's some kind of, pragmatic relationship that they have together, but it's not the best relations, to say the least. I don't think that they see that Israel sees the Turks as much of a threat as they do Iran, at least right now. So the Turks are probably going to be their next target, especially when you consider how they've consolidated their influence in Syria recently. So you wouldn't just have Syria, you'd have Syria, Turkey, the Caucasus countries, Azerbaijan, and if Armenia continues to go in the direction it's going in, Armenia, across the Caspian, the Central Asian countries, that's a lot of Turkish influence. I don't know that Israel is going to be okay with that, but we shall see. So again, this is negotiating leverage for Trump. It's actually pretty smart. It isn't necessarily a bad thing after all. Trump has said repeatedly that his interest is in economic partnerships with the Russians. If he can they can share the responsibility, since this is an area in Russia's sphere of influence. If they can share this responsibility together, that would be a good thing. I don't know if that would be necessarily a concession for ending the war in Ukraine, though. I don't think that the Russians would say, well, if you let us work with you in the Caucasus, right, just to keep things balanced and stable, we'll therefore do this. We'll withdraw troops from, I don't know, one of the oblasts. I don't think that's how it's going to work, right? Because again, there's no immediate benefit to any of it because the development isn't there. There is trade that happens on this route already, but it's just not at the scale that could replace the northern route that runs through Russia. So, and I think the problem with Trump and this drive that he has to just work with Putin economically on something, because basically what we hear from Trump is, look, we want to work with you we can work together on many things, but let's just get this war set to the side. The war is central. We know that this is Trump's approach. It's just like, let's just stop the war and let's just do business together. And the problem with that is pretty simple. And even though they may take a tacit interest in any kind of economic proposal that Trump might pitch, or partnership from the U.S., they will not and cannot capitulate on their core issues that brought them to the war. In other words, I'm sure they probably in many cases want to work with the U.S., but I don't think that they've forgotten that, Trump's part in particular when it comes to how the hostilities started. I don't think they've forgotten that. So that's something that has to stay front and center. They remember the part that Trump and the Hawks played in his first term. And I've said this before, I'm going to keep driving it home, in destabilizing Russia's economy, affecting Nord Stream, their geopolitical posture. And frankly, they really shouldn't even trust this administration, right? But some more notes on the Caucasus situation. Now, the U.S. ambassador to Turkey, and this is where we're going to kind of wrap up here, Tom Barrack proposed in mid-July that his country lease the Zangezur corridor for 100 years as a means of breaking the deadlock between Armenia and Azerbaijan over the issue. Spanish outlet Periodista Digital claimed that members of the Armenian diaspora procured a document from their state contacts, which will also see the deployment of around 1,000 American PMCs to secure this route. If you remember a few videos ago, we talked about the role that PMC's private military corporations would play in Trump's administration. Eric Prince's people are already playing a place in Haiti. They're playing a place, PMCs are playing a place right now in Eastern Congo, between the Congo and Rwanda. They're playing a place right now with the GHF, the food handling, the food distribution centers that are, disastrously trying to take care of the situation in the Gaza Strip right now, to the detriment of many Palestinians, the food crisis. And so these private military corporations are definitely seem to be the preferred methods by this administration in certain hotspots around the world. I would say they're using these PMCs more so than other administrations have. But so in the case of Armenia and Azerbaijan, if agreed to, the report remains unconfirmed for now. The Trump bridge could lead to Russia's expulsion from the South Caucasus. The last clause of the Moscow-mediated November 2020 ceasefire between Armenia and Azerbaijan calls for Russia's FSB border guards to secure what Baku has since taken to calling the Zangezur corridor. So Russian troops have secured this corridor through Armenia's southern scenic region. Replacing them with American PMCs could precede the expulsion of Russian troops from Armenia. Now, Pashinyan confirmed in mid-July, this is the Armenian president, that Armenia will likely leave the CSTO instead of unfreeze its membership that he unilaterally suspended. The CSTO is the Collective Security Treaty Organization. That's an international military alliance in Eurasia consisting of Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Russia, and Tajikistan. Some more on this organization. The Collective Security Treaty has its origins in the Soviet Armed Forces, which was replaced in 1992 by the United Armed Forces of the Commonwealth of Independent States, or the CIS, and was then itself replaced by the successor armed forces of the respective independent states. Former members of the CSTO military alliance were Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Uzbekistan. Similar to Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty and Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance, Article 4 of the CST establishes that an aggression against one signatory would be perceived as an aggression against all. And so this is the agreement that Armenia's president is looking to kind of extricate himself from. He's definitely not like a pro-Russian puppet in Armenia. And that's why there's been a lot of protests in Armenia, because of the sort of the posture that their president has taken, a favorable posture towards the West and Turkey. So this could be the pretext for requesting the withdrawal of Russian troops, withdrawing out of the CSTO, simultaneously with welcoming American PMCs on Russia's southern border. From his perspective, their deployment could function as an informal security guarantee vis-a-vis Azerbaijan and Turkey, since they'd think twice about endangering U.S. citizens, especially those guarding a project called the Trump Bridge. That's not the reason at all that he's doing it. But so finally, what the U.S. wants to gain from this, apart from some easy profits, is setting into motion the sequence of events required for removing Russian forces from Armenia, as explained. The U.S. can also monitor Turkish military traffic across the route to Central Asia, while possibly stoking Azeri separatism in neighboring Iran's majority Azeri northern regions. Again, this kind of brings back Israel into the picture. Their immediate goal, they're not worried about Turkey. I think eventually that's down the road, but their immediate goal is Iran, of course, regime change in Iran. And this is just one component of it, this sort of connecting these dots across Iran's northern border, right? Again, Turkey, and then you've got, Armenia that's kind of moving in Turkey's direction geopolitically, but also Azerbaijan and this large, Turkish-speaking population in Azerbaijan that's very pro-Turkey. And then you've got an Azeri population in the northern part of Iran. And what could this serve as? Could this potentially be fodder for a potential uprising or color revolution in Iran later on down the road? If over the next couple of years, what we're talking about with this TRIP project comes to fruition, could. And then you're already getting, military intelligence, PMCs. I'm sure the CIA is already there in Armenia to guard this whatever project that this TRIP project Trump is putting into place, this corridor. And lastly, we'll take a look at some of the benefits to Turkey, and they aim to capture 30% of flows if, everything works out and, this TRIP project is successful in this corridor. Turkey aims to capture 30% of the flows that pass through the northern corridor by diverting them to the middle corridor. The middle corridor, as we've discussed, is a corridor that, it extends between these countries, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Turkey. It is promoting this through bilateral, trilateral, and multilateral initiatives that seek to take advantage of Turkey's unique geographical position at the heart of Europe, Asia, and the African trade triangle. Ankara's close ties with the Central Asian republics, combined with the latter's willingness to diversify their foreign relations away from Moscow and Beijing, provide Turkey with greater leverage in the region. The EU and Turkey share a common interest in enhancing Eurasian connectivity for several reasons: to promote peace and prosperity in the Southern Caucasus and Central Asia, to enhance commercial access to Central Asia, to increase the resilience of European supply chains. And they'll need that right now, especially when they're making all these weird pledges that they're signing on to Trump's massive tariffs that are going to kill their economies even more than they're being killed right now. 5% NATO spending. So they're going to need this money. So I can see that they're probably very enthusiastic about this project, getting some steam behind it. And they want to diversify their energy supplies. Strengthening Eurasian connectivity would also work to balance Russia, Chinese and Iranian influence in Central Asia. So this is happening over the past 2 weeks. This corridor that Trump is looking to develop with Iran, with American contractors and PMCs. This corridor that sits between Azerbaijan and Armenia, that avoids the northern Russian route where goods from Asia come into Europe. This corridor is what Trump's focus has been on. Why? Well, again, if we look at it as a backdrop to these negotiations that are coming up, yes, it could be leverage, right? It could be a way to, extract some concessions out of Putin if they agree to, let's say, give a timeline or halt hostilities, which again, I think is fanciful. Then Trump says, well, we're going to invite you to partner with us in developing this corridor so that you can make profits too, since a lot of your trade is going to be diverted. And it could potentially work, but I'm skeptical because do we have the capacity right now to really affect anything? So Putin looks at a situation like this and he says, well, I see that you're making moves in the Caucasus, but the infrastructure is not there right now. The war is going on, and that's why a lot of trade has been diverted from the route, the northern route that passes through Russia. And a lot of these countries that the northern route passes through are sanctioned countries, so Europe has to use the middle corridor. And so I think that Russia's economy is likely already adjusted to that loss in revenue from the diversion of goods going through Russia and Belarus through the northern corridor. So they've likely already adjusted to this, and I think that they probably also understand that, any proposals that Trump is making related to this middle corridor, the development isn't going to be starting immediately because the region it's still way too unstable. It's just like the whole rare earths thing. The development for that's not going to start anytime soon, and certain areas of Ukraine that were still under Ukrainian control just fell under Russian control, and those areas have the rare earths that Trump negotiated a deal for. And so I think a lot of this, the Russians probably say, yeah, I mean, it makes sense for us to work together on this, but, this isn't a direct danger right now. I would say they're probably saying to themselves, yeah, this is leverage that you have, but you can't really affect anything right now with what you're doing. Just because they shook hands and you're talking about some kind of, Trump corridor in, between Azerbaijan and Armenia, not going to really make much of a difference right now because you can't bring contractors in right now. Region is still pretty unstable. Situation with Iran is still ongoing. So I can see what Trump is trying to do potentially with this. And on the face of it, again, it's boxing in Iran, it's boxing in Russia, but I don't think it's going to affect the negotiations in any conclusive way. That's just my thoughts on it. So we'll be returning to this topic likely the next time we do a video. Because the summit's tomorrow, like I said, I don't think there's going to be much to report. Everybody is kind of sitting on the edge of their seat waiting for this, but I just don't think it's a big deal. I don't think we're going to learn too much from it. Trump is going to put the sanctions on. Just to summarize, he's going to sanction them no matter what. There's not going to be a breakthrough. So we'll return to this topic after the summit takes place. So thanks for joining me.